Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking into the history and evolution of Taekwondo forms. You know those choreographed sequences, kind of like the katas you see in other martial arts?
Exactly.
You might think forms are all about technique, but there are some surprises.
Oh, yeah.
The sources you sent over show how politics and even education shaped what we see in Taekwondo.
Really fascinating.
It is. So let's rewind the clock. Post-World War II, Korea. Korea is liberated from Japanese rule in 1945, and the sources mention that Korean martial arts were heavily influenced by Japanese karate at that point.
Well, yeah, you got to think during the Japanese occupation, Korean martial arts were, well, they were suppressed. So after liberation, those karate influences kind of naturally spilled over into emerging Korean styles like Kong Soo Do and Tang Soo Do. It's, a natural progression.
Yeah, it makes sense. So Korea was rebuilding its identity, and its martial arts were, I guess, kind of caught up in this post-occupation world. And then General Choi Hong-hai, he entered the picture, a pretty major figure in Taekwondo history.
Absolutely.
So what was his role?
Well, in 1964, General Choi, he developed the Changhun Ryu forms, created 20 out of a planned 24, specifically for military training. And it was really a clear attempt to move Korean martial arts away from that Japanese influence.
Interesting. But the sources also mentioned the Korea Taekwondo Association, the KTA. They established their own set of forms just a few years later, 1967. Why was that?
So the KTA, they were all about standardizing Taekwondo. They set up 17 forms, 8 Palgwae for non-black belts,
Okay.
and 9 for black belts. And this was their way to cultivate a distinctly Korean style.
So first there's this push to break away from Japanese karate, and then the KTA comes in to really define this Korean style, and then the Ministry of Education gets involved.
Yeah.
I didn't see that one coming. What happened there?
So in 1972, the Ministry of Education, they actually requested new forms, specifically for school education. And that's where you get the Taekeuk forms, numbered 1 to 8.
Hold on. The Ministry of Education. Why would they want to get involved in Taekwondo forms?
That's a great question. The sources point to this growing interest in putting Taekwondo into the physical education curriculum. So the ministry probably saw it as a way to, promote physical fitness, discipline, maybe even a sense of national pride among students.
That makes sense. It's interesting to think about the broader impact of something like a martial art being woven into the school system. Did this government support end up influencing the adoption of these forms?
Oh, absolutely. Even though those Palgwae forms might have been technically superior in some ways, the Taekeuk forms, they spread like wildfire thanks to the Ministry of Education backing them. Sometimes organizational support, it can be more influential than technical merit. Pretty fascinating, isn't it?
It is. Have you ever seen that happen in your own life? Where something maybe wasn't the best option, but became really popular because of who was supporting it?
All the time. Think about certain brands or products. Sometimes the marketing, the backing behind it, that's what really takes off, more so than the quality itself.
It's interesting how that happens, not just with products, but ideas too. So we've seen the influence of politics, education, but there was still that karate influence sort of hanging around, right?
Yeah. Even though they put in all this work to create these distinctly Korean forms, breaking away completely from that karate legacy, it was a challenge. And even though the creators were weaving in Korean culture and philosophy, some of the movements, the techniques, they still had those karate roots.
It's almost like they were trying to rewrite a story, but, some of the original plot points kept coming through. Speaking of stories, how did they manage to create the Taegeuk forms in just 4 days? That seems insanely fast for something as complex as a Taekwondo form.
Yeah, a lot of people are surprised by that, but I think it really shows just how urgent that Ministry of Education request was. They were clearly ready to bring Taekwondo to students quickly.
The creators must have felt the pressure. 8 forms in 4 days. Okay, so we know the Taekeuk forms, they were designed to be simpler than the Palgwae forms. They gradually increased the difficulty of the kicks. What else made them unique?
They also focused on this balance between left and right movements, the yin yang principle. Plus, they were designed to be a little gentler on the joints, especially for growing students.
Smart. So they're easier to learn, gradually introduce more challenging kicks, and they're safer for younger bodies. Seems like they were carefully crafted to be more accessible, to reach a wider audience.
Exactly. The Taekeuk forms, they were this strategic way to bring Taekwondo to a broader audience, particularly young students.
And that's where we'll wrap up part 1 of our deep dive. We've seen how those early days of Taekwondo forms, they were shaped by this push and pull between creating a unique Korean identity and navigating those influences from Japanese karate. even government initiatives. Join us for part 2, where we'll explore how different Taekwondo organizations further influence the forms we practice today. Welcome back to our deep dive into Taekwondo forms. We were just talking about the Taekeuk forms and how they spread so quickly thanks to the Ministry of Education.
Yeah, it really shows you how a little support can go a long way, even in the world of martial arts.
It makes you wonder, were there any challenges to that level of government involvement? Like, did anyone push back against it?
That's a good question. And while the sources don't really go into detail about any specific opposition, I think it's safe to say not everyone was thrilled about the Taekwondo forms.
Right, there are always different opinions about change, especially in a community like martial arts. So what happened next? We were talking about General Choi and his Changhun-ryu forms before the break.
Right, so General Choi, he goes on to found the International Taekwondo Federation in 1966, you know, the ITF.
Oh yeah, the ITF, one of the big Taekwondo organizations today, right?
Yeah.
Along with World Taekwondo.
Exactly. And the emergence of these two organizations, the ITF and the WTF, which later became World Taekwondo, well, that was a major turning point in the history of Taekwondo.
So we have General Choi leading the ITF and promoting his Changhun-ryu forms. What was the WTF focused on?
So the WTF, under the Kukiwon, the World Taekwondo headquarters in South Korea, they were all about standardizing Taekwondo, specifically for international sport competition.
Which makes sense, especially since Taekwondo eventually became an Olympic sport. Did this emphasis on sport Taekwondo affect how the forms developed?
Definitely. The WTF, they wanted forms that looked good, were technically sound, and, you know, worked well for competition.
So where did the Taekeuk forms fit into all of this? Weren't they designed for school kids?
Yeah, but remember, they were already everywhere in Korea. So the WTF adopted them as the standard for lower-ranking students. They also kept refining and promoting those Palgwae forms for black belts.
So now we have two major organizations, the ITF and the WTF, and each one has its own set of forms. What kind of impact did this split have on how people practice Taekwondo?
It had a huge impact. Even today, if you walk into a Taekwondo school, chances are it's either ITF or World Taekwondo. And that decides which forms you're learning and the overall style.
It's amazing how decisions made so long ago still affect how we train in martial arts today.
I know. It's a testament to how dynamic Taekwondo really is. It's always changing and evolving.
So we have these two branches of Taekwondo, each with its own distinct approach to forms. Did they stay completely separate, or was there any, mixing of ideas?
That's a great question. And while the ITF and World Taekwondo, they developed independently, there has been some, back and forth over the years. I mean, think about it. Some schools, they incorporate elements of both styles into their training.
So it's not like a strict dividing line.
No, not at all. There's definitely room for individual practitioners and schools to find their own way within Taekwondo.
This is all so fascinating, but I gotta admit, it's a lot to absorb. We've covered Japanese influence, General Choi, the ITF and WTF, all these different forms. Where do we even go from here?
Don't worry, it all comes together. In the last part of our deep dive, we'll explore how all of this history and organizational stuff shape the forms we practice today. We'll look at the differences between ITF and World Taekwondo forms, and we'll even touch on the debate about the future of forms. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive, the final part of our exploration of Taekwondo forms. It's been quite a journey, right? We've looked at history, the influence of politics, different organizations. Now let's zoom in on the forms themselves.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We left off talking about the split between the ITF and World Taekwondo, each with their own set of forms. Could you break down some of the key differences, like what really sets them apart?
Well, one of the biggest things you'll notice is the emphasis. ITF forms, the ones largely developed by General Choi, they tend to be really powerful linear movements, a big focus on self-defense, practical application.
So ITF forms are about being direct, effective in a real-world situation.
Exactly, combat-focused. World Taekwondo forms, on the other hand, they've evolved to be more dynamic, fluid.
So less straight-line attack, more agility, and range of motion.
You got it. They often have a greater variety of stances, kicks, techniques. It really reflects that emphasis on sport Taekwondo and the aesthetics.
Makes sense. Designed to be visually appealing as well as technically sound. So if we were watching a demonstration, we could probably tell which style someone was using just by their forms.
Oh, absolutely. You can really see the differences. ITF forms often have a more grounded look, very direct. World Taekwondo forms tend to be more flowing, almost acrobatic.
Yeah, I can picture that. The ITF forms with that power, self-defense focus, and World Taekwondo with the fluidity and athleticism. It's fascinating how the philosophy of each organization comes through in the forms. But despite those differences, are there fundamental similarities too?
Oh, for sure. Even with those visual and stylistic differences, both ITF and World Taekwondo forms, they're built on those core Taekwondo principles: balance, power, control, precision. You need proper technique and mental focus for both.
It's like two branches from the same tree, growing in different directions, but still connected to those same roots.
That's a great way to put it. And both ITF and World Taekwondo forms, they've really enriched Taekwondo as a whole.
It's amazing to think about how we got here, all those events and decisions that shaped these forms, from those post-occupation years to the rise of these big organizations. It's all connected. Now, I know in martial arts, there's often this debate about tradition versus innovation. Is that something that's happening with Taekwondo forms too?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The way we think about forms is always evolving. Some people, they're adamant about preserving those traditional forms exactly as they were taught, but others, they're more open to adapting, making the forms relevant for today's practitioners.
That classic debate, stick to the classics or try new things. It's a tough one.
Yeah, there's no easy answer. I think the important thing is to be open-minded and respectful of both sides, tradition and innovation.
That's a good point. Honoring the history of the forms, but also recognizing that Taekwondo can grow and change. Like any art form.
Yeah.
It's about that balance, right?
Exactly. Appreciating the tradition and being open to new possibilities.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Taekwondo forms, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I'd say the most important thing to remember is that forms aren't static. They're not set in stone. They're a reflection of Taekwondo's history, its culture, how it's evolved. And by understanding that journey, I think we can really appreciate the techniques we're practicing.
And maybe even see our own training in a new light. We've uncovered some hidden connections, challenged some assumptions, and hopefully sparked that curiosity in your Taekwondo journey.
It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the world of Taekwondo forms. Keep training, keep learning, and keep that passion for Taekwondo alive.